Picture this. It's a Tuesday night somewhere in rural Texas, 1991. No crowds, no cameras, no other teams watching. Just a stripped-down top-fuel dragster, a nervous crew, and a mechanic named Dale Armstrong holding a small black box the size of a cigarette pack. He looks at his driver, gives a short nod, and says 3 words. Let's find out. The car launches, and what happens next is the moment that quietly changed drag racing forever. Not with a bang, but with an eerie, almost unnatural smoothness that made every jaw in that empty pit go slack. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the hidden technical revolutions buried inside motorsport history. If you're someone who loves the engineering arms races, the secret weapons, and the garage-born innovations that rewrote the rulebooks of professional racing, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, here's what most people don't realize when they watch top fuel drag racing. The car's engine is almost never the hardest problem to solve. Teams figured out how to make 5,000 horsepower back in the late 1980s. What nobody had figured out, not precisely, was what to do with all of it once the might turned green. Think about that number for a second. 5,000 horsepower. The average street car produces somewhere between 150 and 300. A Formula One car, the pinnacle of road course racing technology, produces around 1,000. A top-fuel dragster in 1991 was making 5 times that, compressed into a 2,300-pound chassis, applied through 2 rear tires, each about 18 inches wide, to a concrete surface no larger than the footprint of a dining table. Here's the thing about physics. It doesn't care how much horsepower you have. It cares how much grip you have. And grip is finite. It is a brutally unforgiving ceiling. And in 1991, every top fuel team in the country was slamming into that ceiling run after run after run. The tires would smoke, the car would shake. Drivers would have to pedal, back off the throttle mid-run, praying the tires would hook back up before they blew an advantage they couldn't recover. The crews weren't idiots. These were some of the smartest mechanical minds in American motorsport. They understood the problem deeply. The challenge was clutch management. You see, a top fuel car doesn't use a traditional transmission the way a street car does. It uses a multi-disc clutch system that has to manage an almost incomprehensible amount of torque. At launch, you don't want the clutch fully locked. If it is, you're sending every single one of those horsepower straight to the tire at once, and the tire simply cannot handle it. It spins. You lose. So teams designed clutches that would slip at launch, intentionally allowing some power to bleed off and then progressively lock up as the car accelerated and aerodynamic downforce began pressing the tires harder into the track. The way they controlled this progression was entirely mechanical. Springs, levers, tungsten counterweights spinning inside the clutch basket. As engine RPM increased, centrifugal force threw those weights outward, increasing clutch pressure. It was elegant in concept, but it was also completely analog. Once you staged the car and launched it, the clutch was on its own program. It followed the laws of physics, the same laws whether the track was cold or hot, tacky or greasy, at sea level or a mile high. The crew chief had set it up in the pit. Whatever happened on the track, happened. There was no adjustment, no adaptation, no real-time response to conditions. Crew chiefs became artists of pre-run preparation. They'd study time slips the way a doctor studies x-rays. They'd watch slow-motion video of tire wrinkle, that slight deformation of the sidewall just before a tire either hooks up or gives out, and make micro-adjustments to spring pressures and lever ratios between rounds. They got extraordinarily good at it. But good wasn't good enough. Because no matter how skilled you were still guessing. You were setting a mechanical program and hoping the track cooperated. Dale Armstrong was the crew chief for Kenny Bernstein's Budweiser King Top Fuel team, and he was already a legend. He'd been the engineering mind behind Bernstein becoming the first driver in history to break 300 miles per hour, a milestone that had felt as distant as the sound barrier once had. Armstrong wasn't satisfied with that. He had this quality that separates the truly great innovators from the merely excellent. He couldn't stop asking, why not? Why not control clutch pressure electronically? Why not give the team the ability to program exactly how much slip the clutch applies at exactly which moment during the run? Why not take the physics of centrifugal force, which couldn't respond to a bad track condition or an engine stumble, and put a computer brain alongside it that could? Now, you might be thinking, that sounds like it would have been obvious. Why wasn't everyone doing this? And the answer is beautifully simple. Because in 1991, the idea of electronic control systems in drag racing was essentially science fiction. Most race cars were still using mechanical fuel injection. Digital data acquisition was in its infancy. The concept of programming a race car's behavior the way you'd program a machine on a factory floor simply wasn't in the vocabulary of most racing engineers. But Armstrong came from a different tradition. He'd grown up tinkering. He understood electronics not as something exotic, but as another set of tools. And he started seeing the clutch problem not as a mechanical puzzle, but as a process control challenge. The same kind of problem engineers solve in manufacturing plants and aerospace systems every single day. He built his first clutch timer in secret, working alone in his Texas shop, away from competitors, away from cameras, away from the prying eyes of rival teams. The device itself was modest-looking, a small programmable timer connected to a hydraulic or pneumatic actuator that could apply and release clutch pressure on command. The timer could be set with multiple stages, each lasting fractions of a second, telling the clutch exactly how hard to bite at each moment in the run. The genius wasn't just in the hardware, it was in how Armstrong layered it onto the existing mechanical system. He didn't rip out the springs and counterweights that clutch experts had spent decades perfecting, he kept them. He added the timer on top, as an enhancement, a force multiplier for everything teams already knew. Think of it like the difference between a mechanical watch and a quartz movement. The mechanical watch is an engineering marvel. The quartz movement doesn't replace that marvel, it just makes the timekeeping orders of magnitude more precise. Armstrong's timer could do something no mechanical system ever could. It could compensate in real time. A bump in the track surface at 200 miles per hour that would normally cause the clutch to momentarily unload, leading to a tire-spinning engine flare, could be anticipated in the program and counteracted with a pre-timed pressure reduction. A torque spike from the supercharger coming into full boost, a moment that punished mechanical clutches mercilessly, could be smoothed out with a precisely timed backing off of clamping force. The first secret test runs confirmed what Armstrong had theorized. The car launched smoother. 60 foot times, the measurement of how well a car accelerates in the first 60 feet, considered the truest indicator of launch quality, tightened up dramatically. Where times had varied by 2 or 3 hundredths of a second from run to run under identical conditions, they now stayed within a few thousandths. The car didn't shake, the driver didn't have to pedal. Run after run, in cold air, in hot air, on fresh track, on worn track, the car just worked. And for 3 years, nobody outside that team knew why. The other teams knew something was wrong. They just couldn't figure out what. You could see it in the pit lane body language. Crew chiefs huddling over time slips, shaking their heads. Rival tuners watching Bernstein's car on slow motion playback, frame by frame, looking for something, anything that explained why that car kept running cleaner than everything else on the property. Some teams assumed it was tire compounds. Others suspected exotic clutch disc materials being smuggled in from aerospace suppliers. A few quietly wondered if the fuel was hotter than legal limits. None of them were even close. Here's what makes Armstrong's 3-year run of secrecy so remarkable. It wasn't just that the timer worked. It's that the advantage it created looked, from the outside, like something completely explainable by conventional means. When a competitor's car smokes the tires, you know exactly what happened. When Armstrong's car ran a perfect pass, it just looked like a well-tuned car running a perfect pass. The weapon was invisible because its effects looked normal. A flawless launch doesn't announce itself. It just is. Meanwhile, Armstrong was accumulating something more valuable than trophies. He was accumulating data. This is where it gets really interesting, because a timer didn't just control the clutch. It logged what the clutch was actually doing during every run. For the first time in Top Fuel history, a team could look at a graph after a pass and see the exact clutch pressure curve from launch to finish line. They could overlay it against engine RPM, drive shaft speed, and G-force measurements. And what that data showed them fundamentally rewrote what the sport thought it knew about power delivery. Here's what most people don't realize. Before Armstrong's timer, the entire theoretical framework of clutch management in Top Fuel was built on educated guesswork. Smart guesswork, refined over decades by brilliant mechanical minds, but guesswork nonetheless. Teams knew that clutch slip was necessary at launch. They knew it had to decrease as speed increased, but the exact shape of that curve, the precise moments when slip should increase or decrease, that was art, not science. It was feel, it was experience. It was a crew chief squinting at a time slip and saying, "I think we need a little more leg in the second stage," based on gut instinct developed over years. Armstrong's data destroyed some of those assumptions completely. The most surprising discovery, optimal clutch application, was not a smooth progression. Everyone had assumed the ideal curve was essentially a ramp. Start soft, gradually increase, finish locked. What the data actually showed was that there were specific micro moments during the run where slightly reducing clutch pressure produced faster elapsed times. Not backing off dramatically, not pedaling, just tiny, precise reductions lasting fractions of a second that gave the tires a microscopic breathing space before the next wave of acceleration. No mechanical system could have done this. Springs and counterweights follow centrifugal physics. They can't back off for 40 milliseconds at the 0.7 second mark because the data says the tire needs a moment to recover. A timer can. And now Armstrong had proof, logged, repeatable, downloadable proof, that these micro adjustments were worth real hundreds of a second over the course of a 1,320-foot run. He also discovered something that changed how teams thought about weather and track conditions forever. Clutch slip requirements don't just change between tracks, they change between rounds at the same track on the same day. As the sun moves across the sky and track surface temperature shifts, the tire's grip characteristics change in ways that feel invisible but show up clearly in the data. On a cool morning session, Armstrong's logs showed the tire needed a softer initial hit and more gradual progression. By mid-afternoon, with the track rubbered in and temperatures climbing, the car could take a harder launch without consequence. Before the timer, accommodating these changes meant physically going into the bell housing between rounds, removing the clutch cover, swapping springs, adjusting lever geometry, a process that took time, required precision, and introduced the possibility of mechanical error. With Armstrong's timer, adjusting for a temperature swing was a programming change. It took minutes. It introduced no mechanical variables. And because the adjustment was digital rather than physical, it could be reversed instantly if conditions change back. The competitive implications were staggering. Think about what this meant for a race weekend. A mechanical clutch team might make 3 or 4 significant clutch adjustments across a day of qualifying and eliminations, each one a calculated gamble based on experience and intuition. Armstrong's team could make a dozen precise, data-driven adjustments, each one informed by exactly what the car had done the previous run. They weren't guessing at the shape of the optimal curve anymore. They were measuring it, refining it, converging on it with scientific precision. Look, there's a reason Armstrong's team performed so consistently across such a wide range of conditions. It wasn't luck. It wasn't superior horsepower. In many cases, competitors were running similar or even greater power. The difference was utilization. Armstrong had found the way to apply more of the available power more effectively, more of the time under more conditions. In racing, that's not a marginal advantage, that's a structural one. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but the NHRA had to catch on eventually, right? And here's where the story takes a turn that reveals something important about the nature of rules in any competitive system. Armstrong wasn't hiding the timer because it was illegal. He was hiding it because it was legal. The NHRA rulebook in 1991 was exhaustive on the subject of clutch components. It specified disc diameters, maximum number of discs, allowable lever ratios, approved materials for clutch floaters and pressure plates. What it did not contain, what it had never occurred to the rule writers to address, was any mention of electronic devices influencing clutch behavior, because nobody had ever imagined such a device existed. This is a critical distinction that gets lost in how some people tell the story. Armstrong wasn't a cheater who found the loophole. He was an innovator who found a frontier. There's a profound difference. Cheating means breaking an existing rule while pretending you're not. What Armstrong did was operate in territory the rulebook didn't even have language for. He was playing within the rules so completely that the rules themselves couldn't describe what he was doing. There's a useful analogy here. Think about the early days of the internet and digital music. The laws governing music distribution were written for a world of physical media, vinyl records, cassette tapes, CDs. When digital downloads arrived, there was this strange period where a lot of what was happening wasn't clearly legal or illegal. It was just unaddressed. The laws hadn't imagined the technology. Armstrong's timer existed in that same gray zone, not because it was ethically ambiguous, but because it was technically unprecedented. The NHRA eventually had to confront this, and their response, when word of the timer finally began leaking through the racing community, was telling. They didn't ban it. They couldn't, really, not without admitting they'd been outmaneuvered, and not without triggering a legitimate debate about whether Armstrong's team owed competition refunds for races run under what some might argue were unclear technical regulations. Instead, they did what any smart governing body does when innovation outruns the rulebook. They wrote new rules around the technology, legitimizing it while establishing parameters for its use. The leak itself happened slowly, the way most race secrets eventually do. Not through a dramatic confession or a tabloid exposé, but through the accumulated weight of small observations. A photographer's long lens catching an unfamiliar wire routing in the bell housing area. A former crew member's carefully worded hint at an industry dinner. A competitor's data analyst noticing that the Bernstein car's performance curve didn't match any mechanical clutch behavior they'd ever modeled. The pieces assembled themselves over time until the picture was undeniable. When competitors finally understood what they were dealing with, the response was immediate and almost frantic. Teams that have been in drag racing for decades, that had mechanical clutch tuning refined to a near art form, suddenly found themselves starting from zero in a completely different technical discipline. It wasn't enough to be a great mechanic anymore. You needed someone who understood programmable logic controllers. You needed data acquisition expertise. You needed to think about clutch management the way a software engineer thinks about code, in stages, in conditionals, in inputs and outputs. Some teams made the transition smoothly, others struggled. A few veteran tuners whose entire value to their organizations had been built on decades of mechanical intuition found that intuition suddenly less relevant in a world where a laptop could map the optimal clutch curve more accurately than any human gut feeling. It was disruptive in the truest sense of the word. Not just a better solution to an old problem, but a solution that made the old approach look inadequate by comparison. The arms race that followed was extraordinary. Within 18 months of the timer becoming common knowledge, every major top fuel team had some form of electronic clutch control. Within 3 years, the systems had evolved from Armstrong's relatively simple stage timers into genuinely sophisticated closed-loop control systems that could sense what the tire was doing in real time and adjust clutch pressure accordingly. The innovation curve that Armstrong had started was now nearly vertical, and the elapsed times fell off a cliff. Not gradually, dramatically. The combination of electronic clutch control and the engineering focus it enabled, teams now optimizing their entire power delivery philosophy around precise clutch management, produced performance gains that compressed years of expected development into months. Here's what nobody talks about. The timer didn't just change the cars, it changed the people. Not just the engineers, not just the crew chiefs. It changed who got hired, who got promoted, who became valuable in a sport that had always rewarded a specific kind of intelligence. For 50 years, the most important person on a top fuel team wasn't the driver. It was the grizzled veteran mechanic who could look at a clutch disc, feel the heat coming off it, and tell you within a few pounds per square inch how hard it had been hitting. That person's value was built on something irreplaceable: time. Years of accumulated tactile knowledge that lived in their hands and their gut, and nowhere else. Armstrong's timer made some of that knowledge obsolete almost overnight. Not worthless, the foundational understanding of clutch physics still mattered, but no longer sufficient on its own. Suddenly, teams needed people who could read data logs the way the old-timers read time slips, people who understood feedback loops and control theory, people who had never touched the race car but had spent years programming industrial automation systems, aerospace engineers, process control specialists, people whose resumes would have been laughed out of a drag racing pit 2 years earlier. This is where it gets really interesting, because the cultural shift inside top fuel teams mirrored something that was happening across American industry in the early 1990s. Manufacturing plants were discovering that computerized process control could outperform even the most experienced human operators in consistency and precision. Hospitals were learning that algorithmic diagnostic tools could catch patterns that experienced physicians missed. The drag racing pit lane was just another theater for the same fundamental disruption, the moment when accumulated human expertise met systematic data collection, and data started winning. Here's the thing, though. The teams that navigated this transition best weren't the ones who threw out their old knowledge and replaced it wholesale with computers. They were the teams that figured out how to marry both. The veterans who understood why a clutch behaved a certain way, the physics, the metallurgy, the thermodynamics, became exponentially more valuable when you gave them access to precise data, because now they could test their intuitions rigorously. They could say, I think the clutch is hitting too hard at the half-track bump, and then actually look at a graph that confirmed or refuted it, rather than arguing from feel alone. Armstrong himself embodied the synthesis. He wasn't a computer scientist who wandered into drag racing. He was a mechanic who learned enough electronics to build a device that made his mechanical knowledge more effective. That distinction matters enormously. The timer wasn't artificial intelligence replacing human expertise. It was a tool that extended human expertise into domains where unaided human perception simply couldn't reach. The millisecond world of clutch engagement, where everything happens too fast to see, too fast to feel, too fast for any human reflexes to influence. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but what did this mean for the drivers? Because on the surface, it sounds like the driver's job just got easier. Smoother launches, more predictable cars, less tire shake to manage. And in some narrow sense, that's true. But the full picture is more complicated and honestly more interesting. Here's what most people don't realize about top fuel driving. The job was never really about throttle control. Unlike, say, sports car racing, where a driver's throttle modulation through a corner is a critical skill that separates fast drivers from slow ones. A top fuel driver's primary input, the throttle, goes to the floor and stays there for the entire run in ideal conditions. The skill was in the launch, the reaction time, the ability to read when the car was about to shake and pedal before it got out of shape. Experienced drivers developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to the car's behavior in the first few hundred feet of a run. What the timer did was reduce the frequency of those crisis moments where a driver had to intervene. Fewer tire shake events meant fewer pedaling decisions. Less chassis drama meant drivers could focus more completely on reaction time and race strategy, watching the opponent's car, timing the approach to the beams, executing the pre-stage and stage sequence with maximum precision. In a perverse way, the timer made the cognitive load of driving a top fuel car heavier in some respects, because it removed the immediate physical feedback loops that had previously occupied part of the driver's attention and forced them to be more mentally present for the strategic elements of the race. The data from Armstrong's early timer runs revealed something surprising about driver behavior too. When cars launched more smoothly, drivers were actually slower to react to the rare instances when something did go wrong. The body and brain, calibrated by thousands of runs to expect a certain level of violence and unpredictability, were caught off guard by the unfamiliar smoothness. It took drivers a season or more to recalibrate their instincts to the new baseline. Some never fully made the adjustment. This phenomenon, the way automation changes human performance in ways that aren't immediately obvious, became a significant area of study in the years that followed, not just in drag racing, but in aviation, where autopilot systems were producing similar recalibration challenges in commercial pilots. Armstrong's timer was, in a small way, an early real-world laboratory for questions that would consume human factors researchers for decades. The financial architecture of top fuel racing shifted too, and this part of the story rarely gets told. Before electronic clutch control, the cost of competitive clutch systems was substantial but relatively predictable. Quality components, skilled labor to assemble and adjust them, replacement parts after each run, the variables were manageable. A team with a disciplined budget and good mechanical staff could be competitive. The timer changed the cost structure in ways that widened the gap between well-funded and modestly funded teams. First-generation timer systems weren't cheap, but they were within reach. The second and third-generation systems that followed, incorporating multiple sensors, real-time adjustment capability, sophisticated data logging, required investment levels that only the biggest sponsored teams could sustain comfortably. The engineering talent required to develop and optimize these systems commanded salaries that looked nothing like traditional race mechanic wages. Data analysts, systems engineers, electronics specialists, these people had options in other industries and needed to be paid accordingly. There's an uncomfortable irony here. Armstrong's innovation, born from one mechanic's ingenuity working in a Texas shop with relatively modest resources, helped create a technical environment where the resources required to compete at the highest level escalated dramatically. The democratizing potential of a clever idea gave way, as it so often does, to the centralizing power of capital. The teams with the deepest pockets could develop their timer systems faster, hire better engineers, run more test sessions to refine their programming. The performance gap between top-funded and mid-level teams, which mechanical clutch technology had allowed smart engineering to partially bridge, began to widen again. The NHRA responded to this by doing what sanctioning bodies always do when technology threatens competitive balance: regulating complexity. Rules were introduced limiting certain aspects of clutch timer sophistication. Data recorder compatibility became mandatory, giving officials the ability to audit clutch behavior after runs and ensure teams weren't exceeding programmatic limits. These regulations didn't eliminate the technology, that ship had sailed, but they tried to prevent the arms race from escalating to a point where only 3 or 4 teams could realistically compete. Whether those regulations succeeded is a matter of perspective. Ask a top-funded team and they'll tell you the rules leveled the playing field appropriately. Ask a mid-level operation and they'll tell you the playing field remained tilted, just less visibly so. The reality, as usual, was somewhere in between. The regulations slowed the escalation without stopping it, which is probably the best outcome any sanctioning body can realistically hope for when trying to govern rapidly evolving technology. What's fascinating in retrospect is how Armstrong's timer accelerated the adoption of data-driven thinking across the entire sport, not just in clutch management, but in every technical domain. Once teams had invested in data acquisition infrastructure to monitor clutch behavior, the marginal cost of logging additional channels was minimal. Engine parameters, chassis dynamics, aerodynamic loads. Suddenly, teams were collecting information they'd never had before and finding it immediately useful. The culture of quantification that Armstrong introduced to Top Fuel spread like a contagion. Teams that had made decisions based on veteran intuition began demanding data to support or challenge that intuition. Young engineers who grew up thinking in graphs and algorithms began displacing old-school mechanics in decision-making roles. The sport became, in a fundamental sense, more scientific, with all the advantages and occasional sterility that implies. Look, there's something worth sitting with here. Dale Armstrong didn't set out to transform drag racing culture. He set out to solve a specific, concrete problem. How do you apply 5,000 horsepower to the ground more effectively than your competitors? The cultural transformation was a side effect of the solution. And this is true of most genuine innovations. They solve one problem and create a cascade of secondary effects that the innovator never anticipated and couldn't have planned for. The teams that adapted fastest to this new environment weren't necessarily the most technically sophisticated. They were the ones with the organizational flexibility to incorporate new expertise without losing the institutional knowledge they'd built over decades. The ones that failed tended to fall into one of two traps: clinging too hard to mechanical tradition and dismissing the timer's implications until they were too far behind to catch up, or embracing the technology so enthusiastically that they discarded veteran knowledge that still had genuine value. Balance, as it turns out, is as important in organizational adaptation as it is in chassis setup. 30 years later, the ghost of Armstrong's timer shows up in places he never could have imagined. Not just in drag racing, not just in motorsport, in the transmission of your daily driver, in the launch control system of a Tesla, in the traction management software of a commercial airliner touching down on a wet runway. The fundamental insight Armstrong encoded into that cigarette pack-sized box, that power delivery is a software problem as much as a mechanical one, turned out to be one of the defining engineering philosophies of the late 20th and early 21st century. He just happened to prove it first on a quarter mile of Texas asphalt with 5,000 horsepower and nobody watching. Here's the thing about truly foundational ideas. They don't stay in the box you put them in. They leak. They spread through adjacent industries carried by engineers who worked on the original problem and then moved on, by suppliers who developed components for one application and realized they had broader utility, by competitors who reverse engineered the concept and then improved it past the original. Armstrong's timer was a sealed secret for 3 years. After that, it became a template, not just for clutch control, but for a way of thinking about machine behavior that propagated far beyond drag racing. Consider the dual clutch transmission, now standard equipment in dozens of performance street cars. The engineering challenge it solves is essentially identical to the one Armstrong tackled. How do you manage clutch engagement with enough precision and speed that a human driver's blunt, relatively slow inputs can be translated into optimal power transfer? The answer, in both cases, is programmable electronic control. The specific hardware is different. The underlying philosophy is the same. Apply clutch pressure progressively, adaptively, based on sensed conditions rather than fixed mechanical programming. Or consider modern launch control systems. You press a button in a performance car, hold the brake, floor the throttle, release the brake, and the car manages throttle, clutch, and traction control simultaneously to produce the fastest possible acceleration without spinning the tires. That's Armstrong's timer concept extended, refined, and miniaturized into a system that fits on a circuit board the size of a playing card. The car is doing in real time what Armstrong had to pre-program stage by stage, sensing the boundary of available traction and applying power right up to that boundary without crossing it. What makes this lineage remarkable is how quickly the concept escaped its original context. Armstrong developed his timer between roughly 1989 and 1991. By 1995, electronic clutch management was standard in professional drag racing. By 2000, Formula One teams were running traction control systems sophisticated enough to modulate individual cylinder firing to manage wheel spin. By 2005, dual-clutch transmissions were appearing in production sports cars. By 2010, launch control was a feature on family sedans. The diffusion from a secret device in a Texas racing shop to mass-market consumer technology took less than 20 years. Now, you might be thinking, surely other people were working on these ideas simultaneously. And that's fair. Innovation is rarely a single source. But the drag racing application was uniquely brutal as a proving ground. No other motorsport demanded this level of clutch management precision under these conditions. Formula One cars of the era made less torque. Sports cars had multiple gears to distribute the load. Only Top Fuel presented the specific combination of extreme power, limited grip, and extremely short time windows that made Armstrong's problem so acute, and therefore his solution so precisely engineered. That specificity mattered, because Armstrong wasn't building a theoretical system. He was building something that had to work at 200 miles per hour with 5,000 horsepower trying to tear it apart, run after run, in all weather conditions, maintained by people with grease on their hands rather than clean room protocols. That constraint produced a robustness in the design philosophy that purely academic approaches to the same problem might not have achieved. The timer had to be not just clever, but durable, not just accurate, but reliable. The racing environment stress-tested the concept in ways that no laboratory ever could. This is worth lingering on because it speaks to something important about where genuine technical progress actually comes from. There's a persistent cultural mythology that fundamental innovation happens in universities and corporate research labs, that the path runs from basic research to applied research to commercial application. And sometimes that's true. But an equally valid and historically common path runs in the opposite direction, from an acute practical problem to a working solution built under constraints to theoretical understanding of why the solution works to broader application. Armstrong didn't understand the full theoretical implications of what he was building. He understood that it worked, and he understood why in mechanical and intuitive terms. The theoretical framework came later, built by people studying what he'd done. Here's what most people don't realize about the modern top fuel clutch systems that descended from Armstrong's original timer. They are, by any reasonable measure, more computationally complex than the systems that guided the Apollo spacecraft to the moon. Not metaphorically, literally. A current generation top fuel clutch management system processes more data points per second and executes more conditional decisions per run than the onboard computers of the Saturn V rocket. The computing power required to manage 5,000 horsepower through 2 contact patches over 4.5 seconds in real time with microsecond response requirements is genuinely extraordinary. Modern systems use wheel speed sensors that sample hundreds of times per second, detecting the onset of tire slip before it's visible to any human observer. They use accelerometers that distinguish between productive acceleration and chassis disturbance. Some systems incorporate barometric pressure and humidity sensors that automatically adjust clutch programs based on current atmospheric density, doing in seconds what Armstrong's team once spent hours calculating from weather data. The control algorithms use predictive modeling, essentially simulating the next fraction of a second of the run and pre-adjusting clutch pressure to intercept problems before they develop. The economics of this technology would genuinely shock most casual fans. A complete state-of-the-art clutch management system, controller, sensors, actuators, data logging infrastructure, software licenses, represents an investment that can exceed the entire annual budget of a competitive sportsman drag racing program. The clutch discs themselves, engineered specifically for timer-controlled application with exotic carbon metallic compounds, cost hundreds of dollars each and survive perhaps 4 runs before replacement. Top fuel teams go through multiple sets per race weekend. The annual expenditure on clutch components alone for a competitive national program runs into hundreds of thousands of dollars. And yet, paradoxically, this enormous expense has made top fuel racing more reliable as a spectacle. Before electronic clutch control, tire shake and smoking were so common that a clean, full pass from a top fuel car was genuinely noteworthy. Television coverage of the sport in the late 1980s was peppered with tire-smoking runs, pedaling events, and red light disqualifications as drivers mistimed their reaction to developing chaos on the launch. Today, clean passes are the expectation rather than the exception. The technology that seems to have complicated everything has actually simplified the experience for the audience. More cars making it to the finish line, more close races decided at the stripe rather than by who managed to keep it together off the line. There's a business argument buried in there that the NHRA understood instinctively, even if they never articulated it publicly. Consistent, dramatic, close racing sells tickets and television rights. Tire-smoking runs and red lights do not. When Armstrong's timer and its descendants made top fuel more consistent, they made the sport more commercially viable. Sponsors could count on their cars making televised competitive runs rather than smoking into the shutdown area before the cameras could properly frame the shot. Networks could structure their coverage around reliable, dramatic content. The sport's mainstream commercial viability in the 1990s and 2000s was built in significant part on the technical foundation that Armstrong laid. This raises a question that I find genuinely fascinating and that the sport has never fully grappled with. At what point does electronic assistance change the fundamental nature of what's being competed? It's not a new question. Motorsport has wrestled with it since the first supercharger was bolted to an engine. But the clutch timer puts it in unusually sharp relief because what's being automated is so central to the act of racing. The clutch is the interface between the engine's power and the car's motion. When you computerize its management, you're computerizing the most basic mechanical acts of making a race car go. The purist objection that this represents an inappropriate substitution of machine judgment for human skill deserves serious engagement rather than dismissal. In some meaningful sense, it's correct. The driver's ability to manage traction through sensory feedback and reflexive response, which was once a genuine competitive differentiator in Top Fuel, has been substantially absorbed by the clutch management system. The human skill that remains, reaction time, race strategy, consistency under pressure, is real and important, but it's different from what the sport originally demanded. The counter-argument is equally serious. Every generation of motorsport innovation has faced this objection, and every generation has concluded, through the revealed preferences of participants and audiences, that the enhanced version of the sport is worth the trade-off. Nobody seriously argues that fuel injection ruined racing by eliminating the skill of managing a carburetor. Nobody contends that radial tires made motorsport less legitimate by reducing the frequency of tire failures. The definition of skill in any competitive domain shifts as technology advances. What Armstrong's timer changed wasn't whether skill mattered in Top Fuel, it changed which skills mattered. The real lesson from Dale Armstrong was never about drag racing at all. Think about every industry you interact with daily: medicine, finance, aviation, construction, software. Every single one of them has a rulebook. Not always a literal document, sometimes it's a set of assumptions so deeply embedded in professional culture that nobody thinks to write them down because nobody imagines questioning them. The equipment works this way. The process runs that way. We've always done it like this because this is what works. The rulebook exists in the collective memory of everyone who's ever succeeded in that field, transmitted through apprenticeship and tradition, and the accumulated weight of what has worked before. Armstrong's timer is a masterclass in what happens when someone reads that rulebook differently. Not dishonestly, not destructively, just differently. He looked at the same NHRA regulations every other crew chief studied and saw not a constraint but a map, a document that revealed, by what it addressed, exactly where the unexplored territory lay. The rules were exhaustively specific about mechanical clutch components, because that's all anyone had ever used. That specificity wasn't just a regulatory gap, it was a signpost pointing directly at the frontier. This tension between individual competitive advantage and collective sporting progress is one that every sanctioning body navigates imperfectly. The NHRA's eventual response, legitimizing the timer while regulating its parameters, was probably the best available outcome. It honored Armstrong's innovation while preventing the technology from becoming so complex and expensive that it destroyed competitive balance entirely. It's a model that other governing bodies have borrowed for other technologies and other sports, often without knowing the precedent they were following. The broader lesson here extends into the philosophy of competition itself. We tend to think of competitive environments as zero-sum. Your advantage is my disadvantage. Your secret is my obstacle. And at the transactional level, within a single race weekend, that's true. But at the systemic level, over the arc of a sport's development, one team's revolutionary innovation tends to elevate everyone. Armstrong's timer forced every Top Fuel team to develop data acquisition infrastructure, hire analytical talent, and think more rigorously about power delivery. The sport that emerged from that forced evolution was more technically sophisticated, more commercially viable, and more athletically demanding than the one that preceded it. Armstrong's competitive advantage, pursued purely in self-interest, produced a collective benefit that nobody planned and everyone enjoyed. There's something almost economic about this. Economists call it a positive externality, a benefit that flows to people who didn't pay for it and weren't the intended recipients. Armstrong paid for his timer's development in years of personal effort and professional risk. The intended recipients of the benefit was the Budweiser King team. The actual recipients included every team that subsequently raised their technical standards, every fan who watched better racing, every sponsor who got more reliable exposure, and every engineer who built a career on the data-driven approach that Armstrong pioneered. The externality dwarfed the original transaction. Here's what most people don't realize when they look back at moments of genuine innovation. They almost never look revolutionary from the inside. From outside, in retrospect, with full knowledge of what followed, Armstrong's timer looks like a watershed, a clear before and after. From inside, in 1989, in a Texas shop, it looked like a mechanic trying to solve a specific problem with the tools available to him. It looked like tinkering. It looked like the kind of thing that might work or might not, that might matter or might be a dead end, that might change everything or get quietly shelved when the data didn't support the theory. This is worth sitting with because it's deeply encouraging if you're someone who tinkers. If you're someone who asks uncomfortable questions in rooms where the conventional answer is perfectly satisfactory. If you're someone who reads the rulebook and notices the white space. The revolutions that look inevitable in retrospect were invisible possibilities in the moment they were being created. Armstrong didn't know he was changing drag racing. He knew he was trying to launch a car cleaner than his competitors. The larger meaning assembled itself afterward, carried by consequences he set in motion without fully anticipating. The next Dale Armstrong is already working somewhere. Probably not in drag racing, that frontier has been pretty thoroughly mapped, but in some competitive domain where the rulebook was written with a specific set of assumptions, where those assumptions have calcified into invisible orthodoxy, where everyone who's succeeded has succeeded by working within a framework that nobody questions anymore. That person is looking at the same rulebook everyone else reads and noticing something in the white space. They're probably not calling it revolutionary, they're probably calling it an experiment. They're probably doing it quietly, on their own time, with their own resources, before telling anyone what they're working on. The question worth asking, the one that Armstrong's story leaves hanging in the air, is whether you're the person building the timer or the person who eventually realizes everyone else has one. Because in any competitive environment, those are often the only two positions available. The window between them, the period when one person has found the frontier and everyone else is still working the old map, that window is where careers are made and legacies are built. Armstrong's legacy isn't the specific device he built. Transistors fail, circuits corrode. The original timer almost certainly no longer exists in any form. His legacy is the demonstration that in drag racing, as in medicine, as in finance, as in any field where the rules feel permanent and the boundaries feel fixed, the most powerful move available is to look where nobody else is looking and build something the rulebook never imagined. Every top-field dragster that launches cleanly today, that hooks up without drama and rockets down the quarter mile with that smooth, building, almost musical acceleration, every one of those launches is a small echo of a Texas mechanic who asked a simple question that turned out not to be simple at all. What if the clutch didn't have to be purely mechanical? What if yours doesn't have to be either?